Now with Session 3 we will briefly review three concepts: surplus value, absolute surplus value, and finally and perhaps most importantly relative surplus value. Firstly, what is surplus value? As we noted in the answers to the questions for Session 2, surplus value is the excess of the value of labor, called into action, over the value required to reproduce the labor capacity or labor power which performs that labor. In every society with a development of productive forces beyond the level of bare subsistence, the producers produce a surplus product over and above what is required for their own immediate maintenance. In every class-divided society, this surplus is appropriated by the exploiting class, and the specific form assumed by this appropriation defines the structure of the economic base and hence of the society as a whole. In prior forms of class society, this appropriation often takes a clear and immediately obvious form, whether in the provision of rent or taxes in kind or in the performance of labor service obligations towards the landholder or the state. In capitalist society, this appropriation is rendered opaque by the wage relation. How does the capitalist carry it out? The labor process is the process through which the capitalist consumes labor power and thereby extracts surplus value. Has two characteristic features. Firstly, the laborer works under the control and supervision of the capitalist who has purchased his labor power. Secondly, the product of the worker's labor performed under the capitalist's control is the property of the capitalist. These two features have as their necessary precondition the separation of the producers from the means of production prior to the beginning of the labor process. The capitalist must encounter on the market a class of individuals, the working class, who have nothing to sell but their labor power and no or at least capacity to sustain themselves outside of market exchange. With these conditions given, it must also be understood that it is in the very nature of the capitalist that he or she does not oversee and organize the production of boots, computers, chairs, or any other use value for its own sake, on account of the social utility of these items. Rather, she only produces use values, insofar as these use values serve as the material bearers of exchange value whose production is her real objective. Furthermore, not only must these use values serve as bearers of exchange value, they must contain a greater value than was contained in the total outlay on labor power and means of production required to produce them. Just as commodities have two aspects, use value and exchange value, so this production process has two aspects: a technical material process of production of use values, the labor process, and a process of specifically capitalist production of surplus value, the valorization process. The above are the general characteristics of the process of production of surplus value. In this process, the total capital advanced by the capitalist in labor and means of production has two components: constant capital and variable capital. The part of the capital advanced which is not expended upon labor power, but rather on the means of production, raw materials, auxiliary materials and instruments of labor, is called constant capital. It is termed constant because it experiences no quantitative alteration in value over the course of the production process. The labor power purchased by the capitalist, on the other hand, is referred to as variable capital. It is so called because, as well as reproducing its own value in the product, it also generates an excess surplus value which is of variable magnitude. The opposition between objective and subjective factors of the labor process which characterizes human productive activity in every society and capitalist society takes on the historically specific form of the opposition between constant and variable capital. Culturally, we naturalize this historically specific opposition when we think in terms of humanity versus technology or man versus machine. The extent of this variable magnitude of surplus labor is determined first of all by the length of the working day, the extent of which forms the stakes of a constant struggle between capitalists and workers, which is an immutable feature of capitalist production itself. The capitalists, driven by their inherent need to maximize the extraction of surplus value, are compelled to drive the working day ever closer to its theoretical maximum limit, causing increasing harm to the sellers of labor power in the process. The sellers of labor power, on the other hand, facing this pressure, are compelled to organize themselves to impose limitations upon the extension of the working day. This prolongation of the working day beyond the point required for the subsistence of the worker and towards the maximum possible extent forms the first and origin form of surplus value, absolute surplus value. The extension of the working day towards its maximum limit is the means whereby the capitalist can extract surplus from the producers on the basis of the technical means and level of productivity of labor inherited unchanged from prior modes of production. It is the chief or only mode of exploitation in situations of technical backwardness and stagnation. We can reasonably argue that if the capitalist extraction of surplus value was somehow restricted to its absolute form, capitalist exploitation would not have the revolutionary and progressive character that it does. Rather, it would exist in plain continuity with prior slave and feudal systems of exploitation. The accumulation of capitalist wealth would depend only and exclusively upon the degradation and destruction of the laborer through the extension of the working day as far as resistance allows. However, this is fortunately not the only mode of extraction of surplus value. The other mode of extraction, and the one whose increasing hegemony characterizes fully developed capitalism, is relative surplus value. The production of relative surplus value, unlike that of absolute surplus value, relies upon the shortening of the part of the working day required for the reproduction of the producers, which results in an increase of the portion devoted to surplus value. This is accomplished through, as Marx puts it, the revolutionization of the technical processes of labor and the composition of society. Prior to the advent of relative surplus value, capital extracts surplus value through the exertion of control over labor processes whose technical content is inherited unchanged from prior modes of production. This level of capitalist domination over labor is referred to by Marx as formal domination and characterizes the dominance of absolute surplus value extraction. Formal domination is defined in distinction to real domination of capital over labor, in which capital carries out the extraction of relative surplus value through the continual revolutionization of the technical content of the labor process itself, allowing for ever greater productivity of labor and therefore an ever greater extension of the portion of the working day devoted to the production of surplus value. Sometimes the terms real subsumption and formal subsumption are used in place of real and formal domination. Only with the regime of real domination and relative surplus value extraction do we enter the domain of fully developed capitalist production. And it is the dynamic of this regime which has resulted in the immense development of productive forces over the past 2 centuries, from the industrial to the nuclear and information revolutions. It is real domination and relative surplus value extraction which, through its ever more total socialization of labor and ever greater multiplication of its productivity, creates the possibility of both world communism and world catastrophe for the first time in history. With these thoughts in mind, I present to you the 6 questions for this week. 1. What are the necessary features and preconditions of any labor process through a capitalist extracts surplus value? 2. What are the 2 aspects of the labor process in the capitalist mode of production? 3. What are the characteristics of constant and variable capital? 4. What is the significance of the struggle over the working day? How might this struggle relate to the difference between absolute and relative surplus value? 5. What is the difference between formal domination and real domination? Does formal domination still exist today? If yes, where? 6. What is the relationship between real domination and socialism? What are the possibilities of real domination in the absence of socialism?